So hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar series for the Water Policy Program at Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. The Water Policy Program is an interdisciplinary effort that's focused on utilizing data and information to inform effective policy changes and how water is understood and managed. Today, we're featuring Scott Baldwin from Hagerty Consulting. Scott is an emergency management professional with over a decade of experience in disaster mitigation. And for today's webinar, Scott is going to discuss FEMA's BRIC program. BRIC stands for Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities and was formed at FEMA with the passage of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act in 2018. Its goal is to provide communities with reliable funding for pre-disaster mitigation. But before we get started with Scott, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. The first is to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. The recording of the webinar and the slides will be available after the webinar ends at the internetofwater.org website. We will also send links to these out to all of you who registered. During the webinar, if you have a question for Scott, please use the Q&A box. And at the appropriate time, I will read the question aloud and give Scott a chance to answer. Also, if you're having technical difficulties of any kind, if you'll use the chat box for those, and a member of our staff can help you work those out. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Scott.
All right. Thank you, Ashley. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Well, as Ashley said, my name is Scott Baldwin with Hagerty Consulting. I'm a senior manager within the recovery division of Hagerty, support a lot of states and sub-applicants with the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, or BRIC program. I'll quickly talk through some of the items that I'd like to discuss and share with you today. So I'll do a quick overview of the BRIC program, what its goals and focus and intent is, some lessons learned and what we're seeing as far as FEMA selecting projects, and really the direction that FEMA is trying to push communities towards with mitigation funding, as well as the Justice 40 initiative. So the Justice 40 initiative is a program under this administration that's really trying to funnel at minimum of 40% of funding to disadvantaged communities, and BRIC is a part of that initiative. I'll talk a little bit about the path to success, to being successful in this program. Again, what we're seeing communities apply for and ultimately be selected as types of projects. Nature-based solutions is a really critical component of being successful in this program. We're seeing a lot of messaging from FEMA on this component, and I'll talk a little bit about what nature-based solutions are and how they're incorporated into these projects. And then last but not least, as you all can imagine, there's a lot of interest in drought-related mitigation, and we're really seeing an increase in emphasis and funding for these types of projects under BRIC. Communities across the country are really excited about this, and I'll talk about some of the activities that could be funded under this program and provide some case studies. And then last, we'll have a question and answer session. Again, as my understanding, can enter questions into the chat. I'll ask a couple of times through the presentation if there's any questions that Ashley would like to read aloud, and I'll be happy to address those throughout the presentation. So what is BRIC? As Ashley mentioned in the introduction, it is an outfall of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. And this was really a landmark piece of legislation in the emergency management community. And it established BRIC. And it is now the successor for the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant, which was in place prior to BRIC. And we're really seeing a lot of traction and funding being placed into this program, most importantly. And what the DRRA did was state that 6% of the total funding that is made available for as a result of each disaster declaration would be put into the BRIC program. And I'll talk about the kind of implications of that. It's pretty stark when I show you the impacts to the funding. But it's a major change from how FEMA has historically funded this type of initiative. It is an annual nationally competitive program, unlike BRIC, which required appropriations to fund. Now it's codified, and there's a lot more regularity to the program and the amount of funding available. I also wanted to note that BRIC is under the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grants umbrella. You may be familiar with the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. The intent of that is really addressing flood risk and specifically flood risk to properties with National Flood Insurance Protection, or NFIP, insurance coverage, as well as the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program that's made available to states after a federally declared disaster declaration. So again, you can see the difference in emphasis of each of these programs. The Flood Mitigation Assistance Program is actually partially funded from NFIP premiums. So again, really the focus and onus of that program is reducing risk to NFIP insured structures. And then again, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program available to states after a disaster declaration. States generally make that funding available statewide. So it's a little less competitive than BRIC. And BRIC is, again, an annual nationally competitive program. And so what that means is states like California, Texas, Florida, New York are all competing for the same pot of money. This year, there's $2.3 billion available. Last year, it was $1 billion. So the funding, again, is increasing significantly, and I'll talk a little bit about that, as well as really the aims and goals of BRIC funding. So as far as the priorities and tenets, what FEMA is trying to do is really funnel this money to communities and states that have adopted building codes and are enforcing those. So later in the presentation, I'll go through the scoring criteria, and it will be very clear how they're funneling that money via the scoring of these projects. But it's really just critical to note that again, communities and states that are adopting those building codes, generally 2018 versions of the latest building codes and up, are most competitive for this funding, and it's highly competitive. So every point you can get in and touch on in each project sub-application is really critical. What we keep hearing from FEMA is really that they are looking for projects where these are high dollar and high impact investments that are going to protect critical infrastructure, people, property at the community-wide scale. So projects that have historically been funded under this program have been a lot smaller in dollar amount because of the limited funding. BRIC does allow for projects up to a $50 million federal cost share. So that is a huge change from what we saw under, again, the predecessor of BRIC, PDM, where the projects were capped at $3 and $4 million. So really, again, looking at these large investments that can really drive down risk at the community-wide scale. I've also touched a little bit about the Justice 40 initiative, and again, the program's intent of funneling money to disadvantaged communities. I'll talk a little bit more about how that's defined, but equity and help for really disadvantaged communities is a goal of this program. I will also note that while that is very much the intent, and I believe that to be genuine, there is a lot of barriers to entry for this grant. Projects must be cost effective, and that's demonstrated using FEMA's benefit cost analysis tool. And that is not an easy lift, and unfortunately that prevents some of the very disadvantaged and low resource and capacity communities from ultimately applying and being successful. So again, this really demonstrates very clearly the commitment that's being made in investing in mitigation. Project Impact was even the predecessor to PDM. That was started under the Clinton administration, and James Lee Witt is often credited for being kind of the grandfather, so to speak, of federal investment in mitigation. But that said, you can see how extraordinarily limited that funding was. In 1997, that was $2 million. And as you can see in PDM, when the program really required those congressional allocations on an annual basis, the funding was extremely limited, as this graph clearly shows, but it also wasn't very consistent. And so it was very difficult for states and communities to really plan for A, when the funding would be made available, and B, how much funding would be available. Unfortunately, this has really stunted the kind of infrastructure to mitigation and the long-term investments in building knowledge, capacity, awareness, and experience with these grants is very much lacking. So as you can start to see with BRIC in 2020, we start to see a significant increase in uptick in funding. 2020, there was $500 million made available. In 2021, there was $1 billion made available. And under this year's funding, which communities are actively building sub-applications for, there's now $2.3 billion available. Part of that money is coming from the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. So it's hard to know, what to expect next year. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, there is 6% of the funding coming from disasters. As those disasters unfortunately become more frequent and devastating, to be quite honest, due to climate change, there's reason to believe that there will be more funding, unfortunately, in this program for that reason. Before I move on to lessons learned, I just wanted to ask Ashley any questions. Happy to take a break and answer any at this time.
Not at this time. I look forward to hearing you talk a little bit, though, about some of those challenges that communities are facing, especially the under-resourced communities. What are those specific sort of barriers, perhaps what folks can do to help themselves be a little bit more prepared to apply and secure this funding?
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Ashley. Okay, so a little bit from the lessons learned. First off, let me talk about building codes, and this is one of those barriers to entry, as Ashley kind of mentioned. So first off, again, FEMA is trying to funnel money to states and communities that have adopted the latest versions of the IBC and Internet and IRC codes. So this is a map of the United States and reflects those communities that have adopted the 2018-21. Those states right off the bat get that submit projects. Those projects immediately get 20 points. It's again a demonstration of the state's commitment to building codes and their adoption and enforcement. And so FEMA really wants to reward those states through that program. In FEMA's eyes, and I think through a lot of mitigation practitioners' eyes, building codes are certainly one of the best mitigation actions that communities can do. Only 2 projects came from states that had not adopted statewide building codes. So again, really note that the FEMA scoring, which I'll go into even greater detail later in this presentation, has a significant impact on where this funding is allocated. This next slide, if I were to overlay this on the map, you would see a direct correlation between those states that have adopted building codes and the funding that they've ultimately received. One thing I also want to note is that communities should have BSEGs, or Building Code Effectiveness Grading Schedule. This is an assessment of the adopted codes at the local level. Not at the state, but again, at the local level, and their ultimate enforcement. And communities that have a BSEG score between 1 and 5 get additional points in the scoring. And that's another kind of check to again, funnel that money to those communities. So talking a little bit about what we saw as far as high level projects that were funded and selected, 53 competitive projects were selected. In 2021, this represented a 14% success rate. And that really speaks to the competitiveness of the program, what's required as far as a sub-application to really explain your project, the scope of work, cost estimate, project schedule. FEMA wants to know that if your project's selected, really there's a reason to believe it would be successfully implemented. And that's really the intent of the sub-application process. In 2020, where there was $500 million available, there was a success rate of 4%. So one thing that we really message to communities who are evaluating whether they want to submit a sub-application in this program is, do you have the capacity? Do you have the staff, the resources, the studies, the basic design and engineering of your project to really demonstrate feasibility, cost effectiveness, overall project vitality and viability to FEMA? And if you do, maybe this is a good fit for you. What we also see is as communities that are interested in pursuing BRIC, but maybe need another year or two to really define their project, do some of that initial analysis, the studies. Often we need H&H studies to demonstrate flood risk, as an example. Or if we're looking at a seismic project, structural engineering analysis of the existing structure to understand what it's capable of withstanding as far as earthquake or peak round of acceleration. And then if the structural improvements were made, what the post-mitigation conditions would look like and what that building would be able to withstand. So, Ashley, again, this is one of those barriers to entry that's really critical that communities assess as early in the process as possible to really determine if this is going to be a good fit for their project.
Yeah,
So,
some of those, I'm sorry to interrupt, Scott. We
Yeah,
have one quick question. The question is, can you repeat the scoring program at the local level that makes an applicant even more competitive?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the holistic scoring criteria. I think what this person's referring to is the BSEGs, or the Building Code Effectiveness Grading Schedule. Community, that is an assessment of building codes, and again, their applicability and enforcement for commercial and residential structures at the local level. There's actually a report by, I believe, a company called BRIC who does this analysis. There's a questionnaire that communities have to complete. They would return that to BRIC, and then a BSEGs score would be created, and there would be documentation given to the community. It's generally housed in the county or city's building department.
Great, thank you.
Real quick, again, some other key items to note. Again, we are looking generally at larger projects. And what I mean by that is the national average of project size that was funded was $15 million. I think in the scheme of things, that's still a relatively small project size. But when you look at the historical project caps in these programs, that is a significant increase for mitigation investments in this program. And then I noted earlier, again, this program is part of the Justice 40 initiative. 49% of projects that were selected for funding ultimately benefited disadvantaged communities per the Justice 40 definition. So some very basic eligibility requirements. Projects must be eligible, feasible, cost-effective. I've talked about the benefit cost analysis requirement. I cannot emphasize, unfortunately, the difficulty of navigating that. If I were to distill the intent of the benefit cost analysis in a relatively succinct way, I would say that the intent is, again, assessing what the pre-mitigation conditions are. And to use the flood hazard as an example, if you were to propose a stream restoration project or a large stormwater infrastructure improvement project, we would want to evaluate what the current flood elevations are to structures, and then if you were to increase capacity in the stream or stormwater infrastructure, what the reduced flood elevations would be to structures or critical infrastructure. And that will give us a sense, okay, what are we protecting? What's the value of that? What's the loss of function? And for instance, we were including a major road or highway. If that road is shut down due to flooding and we were to prevent that, what's the value of that? And that's evaluated, in detour time, lost productivity, and repairs to the road after flooding recedes, as an example. While the summary of that makes it seem relatively simple, the really critical part is the documentation to substantiate that. And that's generally done through modeling and historical damages. So this is unfortunately, again, that huge barrier to entry for a lot of communities. When we say eligible, that's defined as projects that align with the hazard mitigation assistance guidance. FEMA doesn't fund every type of project. They have a definition of mitigation and projects which conform with that guidance. And we have to be highly mindful of that. And then feasible as well. Projects really have to demonstrate that they would function and demonstrably reduce the hazard risk identified. I talked through a structural engineering assessment. Again, that would demonstrate, hey, we know specifically what changes or modifications need to be done to our structure, and we know exactly what this building will be capable of withstanding after the mitigation is implemented as far as earthquake impacts. Projects need to be competitive and maximize scoring rubrics. I'll walk through what the scoring rubrics are, but being competitive is really the key word that we use for BRIC funding. If I were to explain to a community what competitive is, we know that FEMA does webinars and a lot of outreach. They're very intentional about telegraphing the type of projects that they want. And so it's really critical for communities to read between the lines and really put forth a sub-application that's going to touch on a lot of those points, and that's really going to grab FEMA's attention in the whole universe of projects that they receive. What's going to make your project really stand out and be competitive, and that's what we mean by competitiveness. I've talked a lot about code adoption and the importance of BSEGs. You'll see the importance of that when you look at the scoring rubrics in the next few slides, but FEMA weighs that very heavily. Projects which can talk a lot about partnerships and really specifically public-private partnerships are much more competitive than those that do not. If it's getting public-private funding for part of the local cost share, There is a minimum 25% local cost share to these projects and match. That is another barrier to entry, certainly in this program for communities with limited resources. FEMA wants to start to see public or private companies recognize that they could stand to benefit from some of these mitigation projects. And if that's the case, certainly provide some of that local match funding. Those are the most competitive public-private partnerships we've seen to date. And certainly projects, to the greatest extent possible, must directly benefit disadvantaged communities. I'll talk about how those are defined and what that could look like. And you'll also hear me talk a lot about nature-based solutions. Again, this is really where FEMA's, I don't know if telegraphing is the correct word. I think they've been quite blunt about this, to be perfectly honest. Certainly a recognition within the mitigation space that nature can in many ways be our best buffer in addressing climate change and future conditions. These types of projects generally require less maintenance. They are in many cases as well, certainly more resilient and to withstanding kind of the changes we anticipate. And FEMA is really looking to fund those types of projects. To give you an example of what we've seen historically, in the first year of BRIC funding, 80% of the projects selected had nature-based solutions. So certainly an exciting opportunity and a change away from our historical emphasis and focus on gray infrastructure. So there's two scoring criteria used. There's both the technical, which is on this slide, and then the qualitative. Technical is pretty simple in that it's all or nothing, right? You either have a BSEG score or you do not. You've either demonstrably benefited a disadvantaged community, or as FEMA would say here, an economically disadvantaged rural community, or you have not. There's not a lot of gray here. There's certainly some subjectiveness when it comes to the qualitative scoring criteria. But again, you can start to see where the importance of getting as many of these points is critical, but you can also understand where FEMA is emphasizing some of this. And so I'll talk about some of the key areas here. Is your project an infrastructure project? And that's really defined as, are you proposing an infrastructure project to reduce risk? Again, that could be indicative that you are addressing mitigation and hazards at a community-wide scale, as opposed to neighborhood or a smaller structure by structure kind of basis. Certainly makes sense from a FEMA perspective to invest in those types of infrastructure solutions because there's just a bigger bang for the buck. I've certainly talked a lot about BSEGs, but again, given that there's 20 points here, you can see the importance of those communities having that as part of their sub-application. And again, benefiting a disadvantaged community. So this year, FEMA is using the Center for Disease Control's Social Vulnerability Index to determine some of that, how to score and evaluate benefits to those communities. I'll talk about that a little bit here in the upcoming slides. But again, another way that they can funnel this funding to those communities. The qualitative scoring criteria, as I mentioned earlier, is, to be honest, much more subjective. And FEMA does convene a panel of mitigation experts every year to review all the sub-applications. They're going to go through this kind of qualitative scoring criteria first to assess competitiveness, how many points you're able to get, and then really this will be the first cut to really determine, okay, which projects should we look at a lot closer. Projects which can get as many of these points as possible would likely move to the next phase, which would really be the technical criteria, but also a very deep look at the benefit cost analysis. So I do want to quickly touch on the Justice 40 initiative again, because it's really critical to this program. But before I did, Ashley, just wanted to ask if there are any questions.
There is one question. You may get to this later on, but just wanted to put this out there. It's from Austin, who asked if you can give some examples of nature-based solutions.
Yes, Austin, happy to do that. There will be a slide later in the presentation, so I'll hold off on addressing that question now. But Austin, when we get to that slide, please don't hesitate if you have any other questions. So as far as the Justice 40 initiative is concerned, again, FEMA must demonstrate now to Congress that 40% of the funding is benefiting disadvantaged communities. This is a bit of an attempt to level the playing field, but really critical component. We certainly, when we're talking with sub-applicants, always want to evaluate project benefiting areas. And, you know, it's really critical to note, again, using the kind of flood example, that sometimes the project area, right, isn't necessarily where the benefiting area is. Potentially by increasing capacity in streams and rivers, or taking some other types of mitigation actions upstream, the benefits are actually felt downstream to communities. So we're very cognizant of really pulling that out of sub-applicants, providing maps, narratives that really explain the benefits, where those benefits are congregated, and to the extent possible, how they benefit disadvantaged communities. And just some examples of how that could be demonstrated. Of course, when it comes to mitigation, we're always going to be thinking of generally hazard and risk benefits to disadvantaged communities. But there could be a myriad of benefits, and this is really where we're seeing, again, the exciting areas of BRIC, in that FEMA is also emphasizing, hey, if you have ancillary benefits to your projects, right? If we can do stream restoration as an example, or we can do a living coastline, there may be benefits when it comes to heat impacts or recreational opportunities, general quality of life components to those projects, which should be highlighted as well. And that's where we start to talk about what's really competitive in BRIC, right? There's the very clear nexus to reducing and limiting hazard impact and mitigating those risks to communities, but also a lot of these ancillary benefits as well. So again, there's a couple of ways that disadvantaged communities are defined, and certainly a lot of states and local communities have put a lot of thought in this. And so we certainly encourage communities to the best of their ability to really focus on projects which benefit these disadvantaged communities, and really being clear in how this project does that. Some examples of what we would consider to be disadvantaged communities are noted on the right side of this slide. I don't want to read through all of them, but again, there's a lot of variability here and flexibility to define those. So that's one component of disadvantaged communities. But as I've noted earlier, the real metric that FEMA is using in this program is the CDC, or the Center for Disease Control Social Vulnerability Index. And this is a very definitive scoring and rubric and metric whereby FEMA wants communities to assess how their project benefits specific census tracts, as noted here. Communities with a social vulnerability index between 0.6 and 0.79 get 15 points in the scoring rubric. Communities that have a social vulnerability index of 0.8 or greater per the CDC map would get 30 points. And as you saw, that's actually 30 points is the most points for any individual scoring criteria in BRIC. So again, you can see how FEMA is weighting this funding to really funnel the funding to these disadvantaged communities. One thing I really want to emphasize, and this is, I think, the kind of the longer term direction of the program, is that the benefit cost analysis, as I've noted multiple times, is definitely a barrier to entry. And because of all the feedback that FEMA has gotten on that component of the sub-application, they are now saying if a community can demonstrate that the project is benefiting a disadvantaged community of exceeding 0.8 on this map, they will provide additional resources and for benefit cost analysis. Because again, unfortunately, these communities have been really impacted by this requirement. And this is kind of an attempt to kind of assist those communities and support them with this really critical component of the sub-application. But I will note that again, while it's a minimum requirement that 40% of the funding go to disadvantaged communities, last year we saw 49 or almost 50% go to them. So, Ashley, any questions?
No, not at this time.
Okay, great. So I've talked. You've heard me mention multiple times through today's presentation about competitiveness, and this slide is really intended to discuss what are the key components that must be addressed, and then really where a project turns and becomes highly competitive. So again, cannot emphasize it enough. Large-scale community-based projects is the priority for funding. And when you put yourself in FEMA's shoes and look at it from their perspective, again, you can see the value of those types of investments as opposed to those neighborhood-based investments. Projects which incorporate nature-based solutions, and I'll certainly talk a little bit more about that, but since it's such a buzzword so far, I do want to talk a little bit about it here. So a nature-based solution is very broadly defined by FEMA, and it's there's a lot of latitude for communities to really define these projects as nature-based solutions. And some examples of that we have seen be successful is, and this is a bit of a drought-focused presentation. I'll get into that a little bit later. But communities that, for instance, wanted to leverage an existing aquifer, right? They want to treat water and then pump it underground in times of abundance. They've defined, well, we're leveraging nature-based infrastructure. And that's one way of kind of spinning these projects. Certainly projects which are not deviating, getting away from the gray type of infrastructure and focus is, instead of concrete lined channel, for instance, planting willows and other plantings to prevent erosion or impacts from high flow areas and mitigating those types of impacts with nature-based solutions. Those are just some of the examples. But as I noted earlier, again, the myriad of benefits that come from these types of approach can really amp up or make these projects much more palatable to FEMA. Again, there might be heat benefits from using less concrete. FEMA is actually asking communities to evaluate, this is the first time, evaluate the impact of use of concrete in their mitigation projects. So again, really an interesting wrinkle in this year's funding and shows again where FEMA is really trying to take this program in its long-term evolution. Projects which can incorporate a public-private partnership, address all the technical and qualitative scoring criteria, the next one is critical, and I can't emphasize this enough. Projects which address future conditions and climate impacts, right? We've historically used as an example the 100-year floodplain to assess risk and project capacity and size and scope. Well, FEMA is saying to communities, if you're willing to kind of assess changes in precipitation that we're expecting to see in climate modeling, and design your project for those longer term impacts, certainly we want to make those types of investments, and your project would be more competitive, all things being equal to a project which is not. Talked about the BSEGs and targeting disadvantaged communities, some other really critical components there. So again, projects which can incorporate this nature-based solution, address climate change, address future conditions, and that's not only through what we expect to see change due to changing risk and evolving risk from our hazards, but also changes in population, changes in land use. All of these components should really be assessed. And again, if you can build and design and envision a project that is going to be long-term resilient and a strong investment for FEMA, that's where we start to see projects be competitive and likely to be selected for funding. Just in the interest of time, I know I'm kind of coming up on time. I do want to leave time for questions and answers. I'm going to kind of skip ahead a little bit. I've certainly talked enough about public-private partnerships. And then I want to talk about drought. Drought is a very interesting hazard. As you all can imagine, in the West, there's a great interest and need from communities to mitigate drought. It's not a project type that we've historically funded with the FEMA funding. We're starting to really see an upward trend and willingness to do so under this grant. So I'll talk through some of those activities and some case studies. But before I do, Ashley, any questions?
No, not that I have a question, but I'm going to wait until you're done in the Q&A, but none in the box so far.
Okay, great. All right, so nature-based solutions, I believe it was Austin that asked a question earlier about this. So again, there's a lot of latitude in how these are defined. A best practice would be that your project incorporates a nature-based solution, which is a functional component of the project. As an example, I talked about the willows that along streams, whereby we're not using riprap, right? We're going to have less of an environmental impact from that type of solution. We're also going to have better water quality and habitat and recreational opportunities. All of those components, are benefits of kind of the nature-based solution. FEMA has put out a nature-based solution guide to talk about kind of specific examples. Some of those they highlight the neighborhood or localized types of solutions, then at the watershed scale. And one area that we're really seeing a lot of interest in the ability to incorporate nature-based solutions is coastal projects. Living shorelines, oyster reefs as an example, to limit some of the wave action or that's causing erosion on to communities and threatening infrastructure that's based closely to the coast are certainly some examples of projects and nature-based solutions that we've seen. Other components that are less functional from a mitigation perspective, but certainly I think would still get the nature-based solution points are projects where there's a benefit to creating habitat. We did see one project where there was a levee that was going to be built, and it was going to be kind of a levee set aside, so to speak. So it was going to be increased river or stream capacity, and that would be very conducive to creating habitat for this type of species. So again, if communities can incorporate these, there's just kind of a natural fit. It certainly encourages that communities do that. We really think that these components make projects significantly more competitive for BRIC funding. I know we got a question about this earlier. Austin, do you have any other questions, or Ashley, anything in the chat on nature-based solutions?
No, not at this time.
So I will talk quickly about drought. Again, I know coming up on time, so I want to move through this section relatively quickly. But first, I want to say that it's really critical. I don't know how many of you are familiar with water rights. It's a really critical issue for states generally west of the Mississippi. If I were to explain this quickly, basically it's that communities have adjudicated almost every drop of water, meaning that somebody owns the water and has the right to it. And so when we're talking to communities about drought-related projects, the first question that we'll always ask is, do you have the water rights? If you're talking about diverting water or pumping it underground, do you have the rights to that water? Because while this is undoubtedly a good idea and probably important to water security, if you do not have those water rights, we don't see a path forward. So just wanted to get that out of the way real quick, but this has been a major inhibitor to some projects really moving forward under this program. So certainly something to be mindful of. Some common types that we see and communities putting forth are aquifer storage and recharge projects. These are projects where communities are going to create wells and treat and pump water to an existing aquifer. The benefits are there's a multitude of benefits in that the water is not subject to migration or other types of impacts, whether that be algae blooms or other considerations. So a lot of benefits here, certainly something that we've seen be very successful under BRIC. And I think what really draws FEMA's attention is kind of the sustainability of this approach. We see a lot of communities coming forth and just looking to install another well or dig deeper for more water and kind of exacerbate the issues that have gotten us to these points with groundwater supply. So aquifer storage and recharge is certainly a very common project type that we see be successful. Again, nature-based solutions, we're seeing some communities spreading water that has been treated and having it infiltrate the ground and recharge aquifers. Again, when it comes to feasibility, we really want communities to be very clear how much water are you spreading, and you need to demonstrate that that water is actively recharging an aquifer. Another project type is floodwater diversion and storage, and this is a great project because there's twofold benefits, right? We are diverting water and retaining it during potential flood events. So we're reducing flood risk potentially. Then that water is slowly, again, infiltrating and recharging aquifers. So we're getting both flood and drought reduction benefits from this type of solution, and one that we've seen be successful in the past. And then real quick, I want to talk through 3 drought case studies to give you some examples or ideas of what has been funded under BRIC. The first project is a project in Kern County, California. It was a $40 million project. The county was going to divert 30,000 acre-feet of water annually into an existing aquifer. This was going to be used as a water banking type of project, meaning that communities that had signed on to exchange water with this water bank could then make withdrawals as needed as well. So a very innovative project, very high dollar, high impact type of project that was selected for funding last year. Another project, drought project, was in Provo, Utah. And this project was expanding existing wastewater treatment capacity to treat water to a higher standard, and then pump that water into the ground and release some of that to rivers and streams to have it infiltrate and recharge aquifers. Utah is in an extreme drought, and I think that was part of what contributed to the success of this project was really the necessity of it, and really that the community came with a very well-defined and designed project. But certainly a new type of project that we haven't historically been seen be funded under these programs. And then last, on the eastern side of the U.S., a drought project whereby city of Hillsborough in North Carolina was going to add some redundancy, add a water pump and an additional line to pump water to another watershed and community that has had some water security issues. So another certain solution to addressing and mitigating drought that we've seen be successful under this grant. And with that said, wanted to open up to any questions. Ashley, anything in the chat?
Yes, there are a couple. So this first one's a bit long, but I'm going to try and represent the question as best as possible. The viewer is trying to understand the extent to which value is attributed to preventing further disadvantages, maintaining or reinforcing disadvantages that occur, or ameliorating those disadvantages. So the question is given, like, for example, how does FEMA think about projects that do not reduce disadvantages versus those that do one of those other things, to the extent, for example, that a property owner in a city have remained uninsured, for example, with the expectation of federal intervention? Does it, help those disadvantaged communities to retain that status quo? And what is sort of FEMA's thinking around awarding grants that do not address those underlying disadvantaged challenges?
Yeah, excellent question. I'll be honest, I think when it comes to the resilience community, FEMA takes a bit of a base perspective when it comes to disadvantaged communities. And what I mean by that is the way FEMA really sees mitigation funding benefiting communities is these disadvantaged communities are most impacted by hazards themselves. Whether that be low-income individuals living in high-risk areas, whether that be the floodplain or other areas. FEMA really sees, hey, if we can funnel this mitigation funding to those communities and prevent flood impacts from them, that is addressing a huge inequality and impact to those communities. We know that disadvantaged communities have an extraordinarily higher proportion of impacts or feeling the impacts of disasters and climate change, that it takes them an inherently longer time to recover and kind of come back to their pre-disaster condition, whether that be their housing situation, their finances, so on and so forth. So it's really, again, I think FEMA is saying if we can mitigate some of those impacts to those disadvantaged communities, That's a start from this program's perspective. I don't think it really goes to, unfortunately, addressing more of those root or systemic issues at this point through this program.
Thanks. We have two questions. I know we're down to 4 minutes, so I'd be really quick here. So with the drought mitigation activities and case studies that you showed, many of them could also be considered fairly standard water supply projects. Is there anything in particular that makes them, resilient more than just the standard water supply project?
Yeah, and I'll be honest, again, this is, when we talk innovation, especially in mitigation grants, and I'll go back, think back to the funding that I showed earlier. And I think that this really demonstrates why there's not so much innovation in this program yet, is that type of innovation hasn't been incentivized. So understanding that, and I certainly don't disagree with your perspective, and that these are generally kind of very simple water solutions and water security projects. From a FEMA mitigation funding perspective, they are extraordinarily innovative. And what I mean by that is, prior to the BRIC funding announcements last year, not a single drought mitigation project had been funded west of the Mississippi. Just to give you a sense of, again, the lack of kind of investment and even awareness of the drought hazard and how that could potentially be quote unquote mitigated.
Great, that's a good point. So Austin is also asking, are there grant winner applications that are publicly available to be viewed by the public? Folks would be great to see the scope of the case study examples.
Yeah, actually, I can put that in the chat right now. I have that bookmarked for just that reason. Certainly something that we get a lot of questions on, and really want to always share. And FEMA sees certainly the value of sharing that information. So I'll share with you the list of projects that were selected, and a very brief high-level summary of those projects from last year.
Okay, just to point out to everyone, Scott's just dropped that in the chat. So if you want to click on that link and get that loaded up, we got one more question. Chris is asking if there have been projects awarded for agricultural communities, just thinking about long-term droughts. Could a community of farmers apply for aquifer storage type projects?
Chris, that's an excellent question. And what we've, to be perfectly blunt, what we've been told by FEMA is that they don't want to address agricultural needs through this program. And so how we've overcome that and worked with communities and crafting projects which will resonate with FEMA has been saying, okay, at the end of the day, this is just potable, an increase in our ability to provide potable drinking water to end users, whether that be agricultural or commercial uses or residential use. At the end of the day, it's just about creating that capacity. And so, we do get a lot of projects, and one of the common project types that we're seeing this year has been, well, we want to increase our recycled water capacity. We're not going to treat it to potable drinking water standards, but it will be used for agricultural irrigation. And in those circumstances, I explain those, well, think of that as an offset, right? You are now offsetting potable water that you would have used for agricultural purposes, which you'll now have greater access to serve your community. So it's we're very cautious in how we frame and approach those types of projects when it comes to agricultural use. But at the end of the day, we all know that there's a need, it's critical. It's really just framing these projects in a very palatable way for FEMA.
Well, Scott, thank you so much. This has been a very informative webinar. I know I learned a lot, and we appreciate you taking the time to remind everybody the slides and the video of this recording will be emailed, the links to which will be emailed to you and posted on the Internet of Water website. Also want to let everybody know that the next webinar from our Internet of Water Coalition partners will be coming up on October the 20th at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. That webinar is about the Commons, and they're building a Water Data Collaborative mainstream network for sharing data through the Water Reporter API. So thank all of you for joining us today. Please feel free to reach out to either myself or David should you have any follow-up questions. Thank you so much, Scott. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise. Thank you all.